Before we start, how many of you guys use React now? How about Angular? Okay, cool. The good thing is that all my talks I try to do from a beginner's level perspective. So as long as you're familiar with HTML, CSS, and a tiny bit of JavaScript, and maybe even, I wouldn't say C#. In Angular, you can kind of say, oh, well, you know, the code's kind of like C#, but not really in React, because we could use TypeScript in React, but I'm not using it for any of my demos. But yeah, HTML, CSS, a little bit of JavaScript, you'll have no problem. Sure. I actually like smaller rooms. I had a feeling there wasn't going to be a huge turnout because this conference is less about JavaScript, but like at our DevReach conference, we had a ton of people coming for the React and the Angular talks. But this will be fine. So my name is Eric. I am actually a developer advocate for Progress on the Kendo React team. And we can just let people file in if they want to, no worries. I started back in September with Progress. Before that, I worked for SolarCity and Tesla. And most of what I did there was create components in Angular for other team members to use for our Service Center applications. But last year, they had a big layoff, and I retrained myself on React and then landed over here at Progress on the Kendo React team. So one thing I would suggest is if you haven't, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Kendo before and the Kendo UI components. If you haven't checked them out in a while, you might want to go and check out both the Angular and the Kendo React components. They're basically built from the ground up just for these particular, for React or Angular specifically. But we're not actually going to talk about Kendo React today. I'm just going to talk about React and kind of where we've come over the last year and what hooks are. Has anyone heard of React hooks in here? Okay, so React hooks, a lot of people talk about React hooks being, kind of, it's a great way of doing state management in React, but it's also so much more than that. But we are going to focus kind of on the state management part. And we're going to start with a quick little demo. So I'm going to hop out of the slides here. And so, come on in. I'll give them a minute to file in. This demo will kind of help to let a few people file in. Who's heard of StackBlitz here? Anyone? Okay. So StackBlitz is pretty much the easiest way to get started as a React or an Angular developer. Also, they have really cool animations on their front page, which I love. But if you want to get started with a React or an Angular application, or an Ionic or TypeScript or RxJS, whatever, just come in here, you click the button, and you've got basically Monaco, which if you guys know is what Visual Studio Code runs on underneath the hood. Basically running in the browser with a nice little preview over here, and you are immediately working with React. So I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time demoing StackBlitz, but I just wanted to let you guys know what I was using here in case you want to go check that out on your own. And it's you can find that at stackblitz.com. I wanted to show you really quick kind of what we're going to be building up to today, and understand that this is also a two-session talk. So if you like what you see today and you want to learn even more about hooks, come to my talk tomorrow. I think it's like 1:30 p.m. But come to my talk tomorrow and we'll continue where we leave off today. What we're eventually going to work up to is building this nice little component on the left here, which is a profile component. And it's just, the idea is like, hey, I've got a component that I want to show on my website, which I need to display my company name, the user's profile image, and their name, maybe their nickname, what team they're on. And then I also added some buttons at the bottom to be able to change part of that state. It's kind of contrived, but the idea is like, okay, yeah, you've got this profile component there, but how does state work in React where if I change something, it automatically updates? So it's kind of like a contrived example of how to do that. I'm going to show you really quick just kind of how this is laid out. So if you see that there's a pink outline around the main component here, which is the profile component. So the app renders a profile component, and that pink line is the profile component. Inside of that, we have a user component, which is the white line. And then we have a team component at the bottom, which is the orange line around it. So we're going to learn how to kind of have like an application that has some state that needs to pass that state down to a component and let that component share it with all of its child components. So that's kind of the idea of the talk, and we'll get back to the demos a little bit later, and we'll get back into the slides for right now. Because before I get into how Hooks works and showing you demos, I really want to go over the kind of the history. Let's see here. All right, so problems with state management over the years, and specifically the ones that Facebook has had, and why they built React, and kind of and I'll show you on the next slide kind of a history of state management in React. But basically, a while back, and some of you probably worked with MVC in the past, you might have realized that MVC pattern gets really complicated quickly. It doesn't really scale for things like state management. A lot of MVC patterns and MVC implementations, if you were to diagram out how the state kind of flows and works in the application, you'd probably have arrows going in two different directions. What React did was Facebook created React as a framework to help them build UI in a more predictable, declarable fashion so that they can move faster without becoming more brittle. One of the first things that they kind of created to help them with the state management was Flux. So this was a pattern that just basically allowed you to have events that fire off in your application, and then you could pass an action to a dispatcher, and that dispatcher would then talk to a reducer, which would modify the state, and then that new merged state would be kind of like the end result, and anything that subscribed to that state would get updated. So that was kind of the idea of Flux. Not a lot of people use Flux as much as Redux or any of the other kind of implementations of Redux anymore, but it is kind of like the grandfather, and it is the thing that kind of kicked off this whole kind of one-way directional data flow through single-page applications. After that, Redux is born. Redux is kind of like it's a merge between Flux and Elm, and it created a single state tree where Flux had several different state trees in it, and basically, like I said, allows actions to describe updates. Updates are applied with reducers, and anything that subscribes to those get updated, get re-rendered every time the state changes. Here's a little bit of history of state in React. Some of these things aren't specifically related to state, but I'm going to kind of talk about why I have them on this timeline. So in 2013, React is released by Facebook, and they have a method in there called setState. This setState underneath the hood basically does all that merging of your state for you. So basically, you create a state object somewhere in your component, and it's literally a JavaScript object, and you can have a bunch of properties in there. And then when you call setState, let's say that one of those properties is like message, like a message I'm displaying on the screen. Well, if it originally said hello and you want to change it to goodbye, you literally just say setState goodbye. And then that changes it, and then anything that was subscribing to that state, or in React, just using that state variable, gets updated automatically. So think if you've ever worked in Angular, observables, subscriptions, stuff like that, same kind of thing, but it's all very easily done in React with setState. Now, next, Flux is previewed at F8 in 2014. We kind of talked about Flux already and what that is. Redux gets debuted in 2015 by Dan Abramov. He co-wrote that. Basically, it was kind of like an implementation of Flux at the beginning and then kind of turned into its own pattern. And he wrote that with Andrew Clark. And he's kind of been the the voice of Redux, and even more recently, kind of like a voice and a kind of a thought leader in React since then. And if you don't know who Dan Abramov is, or Andrew Clark, and you're kind of getting into React, these are definitely people that you should probably be keeping an eye on. In 2017, React Fiber was released as part of 16.0. It was a rewrite of all the internals of React. Who's heard of Angular Ivy? Angular right now is with their Angular 8 is releasing a new, basically rewritten view engine underneath, and React kind of did the same thing back in 2017. And it also paved the way for a lot of developer experiences that we're going to talk about today. And basically, without this rewrite of React Fiber in 16.0, we wouldn't have all the good context API stuff, lazy loading, asynchronous capabilities, which is really the big thing behind the rewrite. But for us, that's not something we're going to be talking about. In 2018, the context API was released. Before that, it had been an experimental feature in React, and they would even tell you not to use it. But in 2018, the context API came out. We're going to see examples of the context API, and then in 2019, Hooks was released. And Hooks basically gave you the ability to kind of take a function and be able to use it anywhere in your application. One of the problems in React was that up until Hooks was released, you could only do state management and kind of hook into other functions inside of a class component. You couldn't do it in a functional component. But with ES6 and all of the, everyone wanting to write, more clear and concise JavaScript and use fat arrow syntax and stuff like that, they want to use functional components inside their React components or inside the React applications, but the functional components didn't have the accessibility and the ability to work with state like the class components did. So that's the big thing about hooks. Again, in 16.0, we got a new core architecture, React Fiber. I'm going to breeze through these slides because I really want to get to code, because I think that's what you guys want to see also. When Fiber first came out, they said Fiber is responsible for most of the new features you're going to see in React 16. They give a couple examples here, but even at this point, we didn't know about React Suspense, lazy loading, context API, and hooks that would eventually also become experiences that we would get from React because of React Fiber. So I'm just kind of showing you guys where this all comes from. Again, the official context API comes out in 16.3. That was last year. Before it came out, it was experimental, unstable, and people were actually encouraged to just go use Redux or MobX for state management. When Context API came out, it kind of started working with your state in React to kind of to give you an overall better experience. And after the Context API was released, now we have a stable Context API, a way of sharing data throughout our application that's very easy. And with hooks, it actually makes the code that you write a lot easier, and I'll show you examples of that. Some of the problems were you would have nested components and you want to share data throughout them, and Context API makes that possible. It also provides a solution to prop drilling, which is something we'll also get into. Remember that word. 16.7.0, released last October, November in React, was our first kind of look at React hooks. And really, before this release, nobody even knew about hooks. They kind of released it at one of the big React conferences, and it pretty much took the React community by storm. It was a huge announcement, and it's one of the reasons why I think today, if you're getting into React development, now is the best time. It is so much easier. The barrier to entry is so much lower, I think, with things like hooks and lazy loading and all these things that you expect out of a framework that weren't there before last year. Or if they were there, what you'd have to do is you'd have to bring in a dependency to do it, and that was very hard to do. React has a RFC process, and hooks was a proposal and follows this RFC process. The RFC is a request for comments, and it also requires that whoever's trying to make changes to React, whether it's the core team or someone outside of React, that they go through this process where they create a proposal. They create a proposal, and it has to detail like the motivation and the details and how this new API or implementation or whatever will work, and then that kind of gets discussed on GitHub through issues. And the reason I'm telling you guys all this is because this process ensures that as a developer that you're not going to just wake up one day and the API has changed and things are deprecated. You get a lot of warning about this stuff. You get a lot of community involvement. Nothing gets changed unless everyone kind of agrees on it. And beyond that, they don't allow breaking changes for the most part. So when you get React 16.5, it's compatible with 16.4, that kind of thing. So this is one of the reasons why I say that becoming a React developer right now is a great time. This RFC process has only been around for a year, maybe a year and a half at this point, and it's something that they'll continue to do, and I love it, and it makes me it just makes me confident in that I know a bunch of things aren't going to change in React over the next 6 months. Again, so a gradual adoption strategy is kind of part of this whole process. And I wanted to show you just a comment that came from Dan Abramov, which I believe kind of can illustrate to you how they think about making changes to React and releasing new features. And let me just let the tweet speak for itself. Imagine React's adoption if instead of showing how to use something in existing apps and libraries, it just doubled down on the "you're all wrong" narrative, right? And just kind of forced things into the project or into the library, and didn't go through a nice process that made sure that everyone was happy with kind of what we were bringing in. And again, this is coming from one of the main guys from the React community, and this sentiment is shared by everyone, and this is kind of how things work in React. You don't just have things just chucked in at the last moment and for no reason. So in React 16.8, which was just released in March, I think, this is the release where hooks became a thing, and it wasn't just an alpha, or it wasn't something that you had to install an alpha version of React to be able to use. So you can check it out on reactjs.org has a blog, and they have a docs section, and I think it's one of the best docs of any of the software that I've ever used. I'm not biased. I really think that that's true. And the blog, every time they have a new release, they basically, you can check out the blog and they're going to have a whole write-up on it. So I encourage you to go check out the React docs, and it'll help you getting kind of acclimated to React. Before we had hooks, we had things like mix-ins, and we still have higher order components and render props. You don't really need to know what these things are, but I'm going to try and tell you really quickly, give you a little bit of an idea of what these patterns are. So mix-ins was a way of reusing lifecycle methods and state across components. You could share functionality between components, and also allowed for kind of a co-location of logic, although albeit in a not the best way of doing things. And actually, React kind of agrees with me. They have an article called "Mix-ins Considered Harmful." They actually, they came up with the idea of mix-ins. This was part of their API, and then eventually they came out and said, "Yeah, this sucks. We're not going to do it anymore. It's considered harmful. Read this article. Don't use it." Higher order components. If you've heard of higher order functions, same thing. In React, every component is a function. So when I say higher order components is a function that takes a component and returns a new component, what I'm actually saying is higher order functions is a function that takes a function and returns a new function, right? So it's just a pattern. It's not like a part of the API in React, but it's a way. It's a way of kind of organizing your code, and it helps you to kind of reuse component logic, like we just heard that mix-ins does. It replaces a lot of the things we used to do in mix-ins. And it still has a place in React. Render props is kind of, if you were to show a Venn diagram of how render props and higher order components help a React developer, they would have some overlap. It's used for cross-cutting concerns. It injects functionality into a component. Basically, you have inputs and you have inputs in React. You don't have outputs. You have inputs to every component in React. And you can actually pass in a function that will tell that component how to render whatever it's going to render onto the screen. So that's kind of an idea of render props, and I'll show you an example of render props because the context API actually works using the render props pattern. However, with hooks now, there's an easier way to do it, and we're gonna go over all that stuff. So just as a kind of a refresher, hooks help to create a stateful primitive that's simpler than the class component in React. It gives you contained and composable behaviors that are consumable in a flat, declarative manner, which is kind of like what we like as developers. That's what we like to see. We don't like a lot of imperative stuff. At least in React, we don't. It makes sharing and maintaining state very easy. It helps you co-locate logic and reuse them through custom hooks, and creates harmony with the context API and concepts like reducers. And my next talk actually tomorrow is on reducers and how to use the use reducer hook. But today we're just going to talk about the very basics of hooks. So again, if you like what you see today, please come back to the talk tomorrow. If I were in an elevator and I had to kind of pitch hooks, I would just say, hey, they make functional components as powerful as class components. They make your code cleaner and more concise and easier to read. Lowers the barrier to entry in React, I think. They solve wrapper hell. If you've ever worked in JavaScript before and have used callbacks, and you've ever got into the callback pyramid of doom, things like that can happen with higher order components and render props. Hooks help to alleviate that mess. It also removes the duplication of logic and lifecycle methods. Basically, if you have a bunch of lifecycle methods in, if you've ever done .NET development, you kind of understand lifecycle methods. A lot of the time, you have like, okay, well, this lifecycle does this, and this one does this, so I need to put all my code whenever the thing is initializing here, and whenever I'm kind of breaking down here. But hooks allows you to kind of separate all those things that you are mashing together in those lifecycle components and put them in their own little spaces. That's the easiest way for me to explain it without going too deep. So we're going to start, and I think we still have plenty of time. Let's see here. Cool. We still have plenty of time. So I want to get started showing you guys how to use useState. So we're going to hop out of this here. Actually, I want to show you these two slides real quick. So this is what a class component looks like for a simple counter button. Like it's a button, and it's a component to every time you click the button, the counter increases. This is the canonical example of how to kind of work with state in React or Angular or whatever. Usually when you see like, how do I work with state? Oh, here's a counter example. So you have a constructor at the top here, which you can declare your state. It has to be an object. You have to do this binding here, which is complete horse crap. You then have a function that allows you to set the state. So every time I click on this button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this increment count function, and it's going to say, hey, I want to set the state, and specifically I want to set the count property to be whatever the current count is plus 1. There's also something missing here that I wasn't able to fit on this slide, but it actually works in StackBlitz, but if you're in Visual Studio Code, it bombs for some reason. I don't know why, but you're supposed to make a call right here called super. And what that does is it kind of helps to be able to use this, the keyword this, inside of a class component. And I'm not going to go into that because it's super confusing. Yep.
What are your thoughts on using the fat arrow to get rid of the binding?
Good point. So what he's saying is if you actually do increment count and then use a fat arrow here, I would use it every time in a class component. The reason I'm showing this is because before you were able to use fat arrows in React, this was the way of doing things, and I wanted to really show, I wanted there to be a big difference between this slide and the next slide to make everyone think, oh, big difference. But you're absolutely right. I can get rid of the binding on the line here if I just change this to a fat arrow. And I'll actually show you guys how that works in the demo. So the old way, the new way, right? Old way, new way. So here we have, what we've done is instead of having a state object, with a property of count inside of it, what we're doing here is we're just setting up a variable called count, and then the modifier, we're gonna tell it, hey, what method is going to update this piece of state? And then also the 0 that's added into the useState, that's just the default. So you can add the default. Over here, I would just add it, after the colon, I'd add the default, and so we could start the count at 0. When you're using hooks, that first, that line number 4 right there is kind of, that's how you set up a hook. And the useState function, or that method, returns two values. One is the actual variable that you're going to be using to track the state, and the other one is the one that modifies it. So what we're doing is we're actually using destructuring right here in JavaScript, and that's actually creating 2 variables. It's pretty simple here. Not a lot of ceremony involved. And again, when we call increment now, instead of calling set state, we're calling set count because that's what we've set up here to be able to modify this variable. And underneath the hood, set count is actually doing all the same things that set state would have done. So you're not getting away from using set state, you're just using it in a different manner. So let's get right into the examples.
So that means you don't actually have to call state other than the constructor, right? And keep track of all the initial state kind of thing.
For a class component? Yeah, I'm going to show you guys. I'm going to show you a lot of these examples right here. So here is that same example, and I'll actually go through some of that now for you. All right, so what we didn't have in here before was the call to super. Now, if you want to pass an input into a React component, you would need to actually have the props here. So having props as an argument to both the constructor and super gives you the ability to, in my index, to be able to say, name equals, Eric. And now, I can now use, somewhere in here, I could do, this.props.name, okay? And you see that my name comes up over there. We're actually not passing anything into this component. So what I'm able to do is I'm able to get rid of props, right? Because this component has 0 inputs. And I'm going to get rid of this again. And now, I don't have to have that in there. And what he's talking about is what I could do instead of making this a function is I could say equals. I could do a fat arrow here, and now I don't have to use this bind anymore. And the reason for that is I'm not going to go completely into it, but using the ES6 arrow syntax actually manages, it actually sets up this property for you, and it gets rid of us having to do the binding in the constructor. There's a lot more of an explanation behind that. Just know that nowadays you can actually just set it up like this, and you can get rid of that binding statement up there. That's the easiest way to talk about it. Now, I can also get rid of, since I'm not passing in any props, I can also get rid of the constructor and that call to super, and I can make this just an object, and it automatically knows when I refer to this.state.count what I'm doing. So this is, so if you just added the ability to use fat arrows and arrow syntax in React, and you didn't have hooks, well then you could actually get your component down to looking like this. So that's a little bit of an improvement. The next one I want to bring up is how to do this with actually hooks. So we're doing the same thing here. but we're using hooks instead. In order to use this syntax, you're going to have to be on version 16.8, not like 16.5 or 16.6. So the code before would have been, if you're working with React before 16.8, and nowadays I can just create a hook. I have to use since I'm using the useState hook, I have to import that in here. And I've kind of already talked about how this specifically works and what we're doing here. So this to me is already a big a progression into the right direction of how we want to write code in our app, how to make it more concise and more readable, and a lot more cleaner. The next thing you're going to want to learn after using the useState hook is how to do a side effect based on state change. So one of the easiest ways to show how a side effect works when you're changing state is to change something outside of the application. Like let's say we can add something to local storage. What I'm going to do is actually just change the document title. And this is actually, if you go into the react.js.org docs, you're going to see very similar examples to this. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because you guys can go and check that out yourself. But just know that we're able to now go out and do something outside of the application based every time that state changes by using this useEffect hook. Yes, I have to import useEffect, and then I can now use this useEffect hook right here, and every time my state changes, not only on the initial render, but every time that state changes in my component re-renders, we're going to get that update of the document title. So if you want to watch right up here, every time I click this, about a half second later, you're going to see that update as well. So why else would you use useEffect? I could come up with some really good examples, but I think the easiest thing would be maybe you need to talk to an API. Maybe you need to fetch data before your component loads or as it loads. Maybe you need to make an update to a database or, like I said, local storage or something like that. So if you've ever used NGRX Store or something in Angular, this is they have an effects library that you can pull in as well that does something similar to this. But this is all right inside of React core, right? We don't have to pull in any dependencies. In order to do stuff like this and what hooks makes available with state management, a lot of that you would have to do with Redux prior. We haven't gotten into any examples that really we would have to use Redux for, but tomorrow's talk, I actually do start using reducers, and I do start using reducers with hooks. And all of that stuff would not be possible in React Core without a dependency on something like Redux. So giving us hooks and giving us the ability to do stuff like this sets up the ability to do a lot more inside of React Core. That's the easiest way to explain it. I want to go back really quick and show you now with that example, with this example of this useEffect, what would this look like in the class version of our component? Let me go ahead and close this so I can kind of do them side by side. All right, so a little bit wider here. So kind of before, after. Now, can anyone tell me kind of what the main issue, how does this end up not scaling, or how does this end up to be a problem if our component gets a lot more complex? What are we doing inside of each one of these things that we really that hooks makes a lot better for us? What's that? Exactly, right? We don't need, now of course I could put this into its own little function or something, but another thing is that also that, what if inside the update I wanted to do something around the document title, but I also wanted to do something around local storage? Well, I would need to put them probably right next to each other, right? Whereas over here, I could just duplicate the useEffect, and then I could do, you know, like I don't know exactly what it would be, like local storage, right? And I would do something there, and I would update local storage here. Now I've got the ability to separate those things, and you can use a useEffect multiple times, just like you can create multiple pieces of state inside of React with hooks. So you can duplicate this and create another piece of state here, and we could call this name, and you could do set name, And then useState, we would probably start it as like nothing, and then we could have maybe another input where if you typed it in, it would actually overwrite using. We would have like a set, initialized name, and then we would say set name, and we would pass it whatever was coming in from the input. So you can use hooks and set up multiple ones, just like you can use useEffect multiple times inside of a component. That's kind of the point there. I want to get off of this example because we're not running out of time, but I want to make sure we have time for some of the other stuff I'm going to be talking about, which is the other hooks that we have in React core. So we saw useEffect, and we saw how to use that, right? Here's the component that we were using before we added useEffect, and then afterwards, and then of course what it looked like as if we were using a class. So the next thing we want to do is learn how to use context. How many of you guys worked in .NET or work in .NET? Do you guys have a context? You guys have an idea of context in .NET, correct? When using like MVC or something like that. I'm not sure if it works exactly the same, but the idea is like I've got a chunk of data, and I want to be able to refer to it as something and use it in different places. So we're going to get right into some code examples here. So this first example, I'm just going to open up a few of these so I don't have to keep coming in here. All right. So can you guys see that okay? What we've got here is I'm putting everything into one file because I want to be able to. I don't want to have to hop around between different files. But we have at the very how this application kicks off is at the bottom we have this render app, and then we can basically follow that up to the app component here, and we see okay the app is loading a profile component. I also know that that profile component needs some data. It needs an input. Here is, so when I first start creating this thing, I think, okay, well, I need to create an object. I need to have all of my profile data in there. Normally, we'd have some type of a fetch call that would populate this, but we're just, this is a demo, contrived example in a demo. So I want to be able to pass this profile data into my profile component, and I know, and I'm going to do that using props, right? The regular inputs that we have in React. So data gets passed into the profile component. Once we're inside the profile component, we can refer to that data as props. So I can say props.data.companyImage, and then I say, and so remember the profile component is this pink line here, and then inside that we have a user component, right? In React, we like everything to be its own component, but I still need to be able to pass this data down to each one of them. So what I'm doing is I'm just to make it really easy, I'm just passing this data down to each of the different components. Now inside the user component, I can then start using all those different properties the same way here, right? But does anyone see kind of a problem with this approach once this starts to scale out? I'm going to kind of give you like props, right? Like even though props are great and it's part of React, and as long as you're doing things in a nice composable manner, it just works. It would be nice if we had a better way of doing this, and if I didn't have to tightly couple all these components together by passing, and this is what's called prop drilling. I gave you this term earlier. A guy named Kent C. Dodds kind of came up with that name for this pattern here of continuously passing things down into props. Now where this gets hairy is think if the component starts out like this, but eventually someone adds another component here, and then they add another component here and another component, and then we have to start passing data into those components, right? Now things start to get a little bit hairy. So that is where Context API comes into play. Now, in order to start using the Context API, I realize I'm I'm going to have to set up a class that has state with it. So if I was using React 6 months ago and we didn't have hooks, this is how I would have done this. And I got rid of the CSS that wraps around these components because I figure that you guys can remember that these are all kind of nested within each other. But notice now, each of our components, none of them have these props being passed into them. We've actually got another problem now, though. Or at least it's a problem to me. Someone who likes really nice, clear HTML, and in React it's called JSX. So all the HTML that you see in each of our components is actually JSX. A component returns basically a tag or a piece of HTML, and that is actually a function underneath the hood. But I guess my point here is that we're running into this issue where we have to wrap the whole entire component in this profile provider. Now we're not going to really get away from that when we get to hooks. But the other problem I see here is this. This is an example of render props. All right? So the way that the context API worked out of the box a year ago was that you would define a provider. Inside that provider, I've got this state object, and then I'm rendering this provider so that when I refer to this provider down the road, when I wrap it around my profile component, I have access to the data that's passed into it. I'm going to show you in a minute how to convert this over to a functional component rather than a class component, but that's not really what I want to show you guys. The thing that I really want to get away from is having to wrap everywhere that I want to consume that data with this silly tag here. And then also, not only do I have to wrap it with this tag, but then I have to then execute JavaScript inside of that, and then I can get to the job of rendering out the HTML that I want with my information in it. So let's kind of think about it like this, right? So what I really want is to just have this guy here, and I want to be able to pass like context.company name to it, right? But I'm not able to do that yet because why? We don't have hooks yet. If we breeze down here, I just want to show you guys all this code real quick so you kind of understand what we're doing. I'm not too stressed on time here, so I can show you how all this works. Again, the part that needs to use this context in this one is everything but the team component, so I wrap the consumer around everything but the team component. Ugly. But it actually was, it actually is a good addition to the framework and the API, and it sets us up for success later on down the road with hooks. So let's look at the next example here. So in this one, no change here. We're still doing everything the old way, but I've set up this function inside of our state object that allows me to actually set the state and change the name of our team. So now I can actually affect that state and have it update automatically. And in order to do that, all I had to do was add this little function here, and I can use this.setState. And I've already shown you guys how setState works, but I just wanted to show you an example. Here's an example where we actually want to be able to affect that state and modify it. And notice that all the places where we use this data automatically get updated simply by being able to call setState and changing team, right? But we still have to tell it what to do here. But this is a little bit better, and this is a little bit more functionality out of that same example. Now we want to see how can we set that same thing up with a functional component. So the only kind of difference that we're seeing here is the fact that we're no longer using a class here. And not much changes except for the fact that we're now able to use a hook, right? So I'm using a hook. Since I've created this inside of a functional component, now I can use a hook inside of my provider, and I can set up the profile state object and a way to affect it here. Now, the one thing I would say is that we have a lot of different properties that we might want to change. So this pattern right here is not going to work for us that great. What we would really need to do is use a use reducer and have a dispatcher here so that we can not only change the team, but maybe I wanted to change the username and full name. And so I'd want to have basically a reducer that has a bunch of case statements set up into it that would say, okay, I'm passing the action change team. I'm passing the action change username, and be able to do them each individually, all inside the same reducer. But you get the kind of idea of how I'm able to set this up in a functional component with hooks, but still not a lot has changed down here. But now as a developer, I've realized, oh wow, I've got hooks now. I've used it here. What's kind of the next progression? How can I use it with my context to make things better, to get rid of this stuff here, this render props pattern? Open a few more of these. All right. So now, what's the difference? Oops, sorry if I can get this to stop actually. What's the difference here? Look at the profile component. We got what we wanted, right? What are we doing? We're not using that consumer tag and that render props pattern anymore. What I've been able to do now is I've brought in this useContext hook, and I've cleaned up all my HTML. I've made it easier for the new guy to walk into our code and figure out how to change things and not get turned off by the render props pattern that was wrapping stuff. And then another thing that people would do when they would come into code and they didn't really understand how that pattern worked, is they would try to use the same stuff that was inside the consumer tag that was wrapped. They'd try to use it outside of it, and they'd be like, oh crap, why is this not working? So now, if someone came in and they didn't really understand it that much, they would still just be able to, create a new tag here, a span. That doesn't work in Stecklets. So you could use a span. Now I could say context dot, I think username was one of them. Right? So, but you get the idea, right? So now I can use any of that data anywhere else inside this component. I don't have to wrap it in a consumer. So I still have to wrap this guy with the profile provider, but all of the children inside of that, I now just make a call to use context. I tell it which context I want to use, and now I can just simply say context.companyImage. And now, instead of having to remember how we were doing it even before all this, we were passing those props into all the different components. None of that's required. We just say, hey, by the way, this component also wants to use this provider. And as long as we have that initial profile component wrapped in that profile provider, any of the components that you see down here inside of it can now use that context very easily. So this is a lot of people got very excited about this. A lot of people, when Context API came out, were excited that Context API can be used, but they were really bummed out by all that extra syntax and the render props crap. What's up?
What would happen if you comment out or revoke the context from the middle component? So it went from the parent, then the middle, and then the very, very last component. You would still,
yeah, nothing would change.
If you removed it from the profile component.
What do you want me to remove?
The context from the profile.
Right here?
Yeah, let's say you don't use it there.
Okay.
For whatever reason. But then you used it.
Nothing. Right? Because remember, each of these components are, the profile component is wrapped by the provider, so it can use it. And all of these other components are inside of the profile component, so they can use it if they want or not use it, right? We're just hooking into the context here. We're setting up a variable called context that's going to contain all of that data. Basically, what this call right here does is it just returns that state object that we need. And by the way, remember in React before, if we just used a piece of state anywhere in our application, that was the equivalent of subscribing to that state. So same thing here, when we set this up, we're subscribing to the state, and any changes that we make are going to get passed down and get updated, and basically that component's going to get re-rendered.
Higher order function, right?
What's that?
It's functioning like a higher order function.
I think that complicates things if you explain it like that. I don't know if I completely agree with that. What I would say is that before using this type of a hook, the way that you would have got a similar functionality would have been by using a higher order component. But I feel like with hooks, it gives you a better experience, and it's under the hood. Yes, we're using higher order functions to do a lot of this stuff. But it's easier for a developer to write this than have to try and understand how to use the higher order component. I think back to my .NET days when I was doing dependency injection, and when I first learned how to do it, and I took like a John Somnez course where he actually showed me how to actually set it all up on my own and do it on my own, and then how eventually I was able to work. I forget what package it was, but I was able to pull in some type of a dependency that gave me a really nice API to use it. It's kind of like that, right? Like I don't want to have to deal with all of the patterns underneath it. And a lot of the people that are coming into React, they're HTML, CSS, and JavaScript people. They're not used to all these patterns, and it's nice to be able to come in and not have to worry about that stuff. However, if you want to get complex, you can do that in React, and you can write it all yourself. And some people that write libraries have to know how to use higher order functions and render props and all that stuff. But even they're going to start seeing a benefit from using hooks as well.
Well, that's the complex way. It's the way you have to do it now without.
Yes. But I'm just saying, so higher order components replaced mixins, right? But higher order components was just a pattern where mixins was part of the API. So again, hooks doesn't replace higher order components and render props. It gives you a better developer experience. Those things are just patterns in JavaScript. I have one more little example here where I've kind of extracted the buttons out into their own component. And then I also just use context there. Just try to cleaning things up a little bit more. But for the most part, I went through all of these examples and kind of shown you guys how hooks has become a very big thing in the React world, how it's going to help you as a developer, especially if you're just getting into React, and how it's going to make your kind of your developer experience a lot better. I want to be able to show you guys this final slide here, because if you have all the stuff that I've talked about, whether it's the React history, kind of how React was concepted, how you would use set state, high order components, all mix-ins considered harmful, all of these things that I talked about, they're all articles and YouTube videos and documentation that I've all made available as resources and links. If you go to this link here, I'm going to leave it up for a second. And does anyone else have any questions kind of about what we've went over? If you guys want, I can show you really quick, once I get through this next slide, what we're going to be doing in tomorrow's talk. And we're going to be building a to-do application. I can show you that really quickly. So just in closing, and I'll do that last so you guys can leave if you want to, but in closing, again, my name's Eric Bichard. I work for Progress as a developer advocate for the Kendo React team. I really would like you guys to go and check out our components, although it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about here. If you'd like to attend my talk tomorrow, it's going next level with React hooks with reducers. And when I talked about earlier about being able to change different parts of that state all within the same function, that's kind of what we're going to be doing with the to-dos application tomorrow, right? We want to be able to add a to-do, delete a to-do, update a to-do, clear all the to-dos, possibly redirect to another page when they're all done. all of this stuff using hooks and reducers. Let me really quick just open up this guy here. So this is what we'll be going over tomorrow. It's a nice little application, and you'll also all the code demos are on that link too, including this one. So we'll be able to add a to-do, we'll be able to complete a to-do, get rid of a to-do, start off with a bunch of to-dos already, maybe, clear the to-dos, and all of that will be handled by a reducer function. Oops. And we'll show how to kind of kick off the events that dispatch the actions to which happen here to the reducer, and we'll kind of walk through building this thing step by step. I hate using my keyboard, guys. I'm sorry, but like I can never scroll correctly, and I apologize for the up and down the entire talk. But yeah, so we'll go over this tomorrow, and it looks kind of simple right here. Especially with what you already learned today, but I think stepping through it and writing the entire thing step by step will be a nice little experience, and will give you, it'll reinforce all of the things that we've learned today, as well as teach you a little bit about how the use reducer works, and this is the stuff that I was talking about. Without a dependency on Redux, you wouldn't be able to do this in React Core by itself. This would not be possible 6 months ago. Yep, so that's pretty much my talk for now, and I hope you guys liked it. And please, if you liked it, or if you want to come tomorrow, please come tomorrow, but please tell other people also if they want to come, because I will go over a lot of this stuff again, and so you'll get kind of like the whole thing tomorrow. Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.